Welcome back to another edition of Cape Ann Today. Heather has a great one-on-one interview with David Rimmer. He is from, where is he, the Essex County Greenbelt?
Yes, yeah. He's actually the director of land management at Essex County Greenbelt, but he is also an ornithologist, and he has a particular interest in shorebirds. And not only does he pay a lot of attention to our piping plovers, but he's been really active in the Osprey program that is trying to preserve these birds and their habitats. So we have a great conversation with Dave Rimmer. It's pretty long, but it's super interesting. But I need to tell people that the very end of the conversation did get lost, and it was really fascinating because he talked about the fact that not only do ospreys mate for life, but they migrate south alone. So when they nest, they show up at their nests at almost the exact same day. Like, they're not really sure how these pairs do it, but husband and wife arrive at the nest, having come from places like Cuba, on the same day. And they made these trips south all by themselves, and then they return to the nest together. So it's kind of an incredible story. And that part of the conversation did get cut out. We may talk to Dave Rimmer again sometime and go more into that. But anyway, there's still a lot of great information about the osprey.
So check out David Rimmer talking about ospreys and the live osprey webcam that we have implemented here too, that you can find on Essex County Greenbelt's website. Enjoy.
Well, a little bit about the natural history of osprey. As a species, they nest across the globe. They nest on every continent but Antarctica, which is very interesting. So they're real generalists. They can nest on, all they really need is to be near water with fish in it, because they feed almost exclusively on fish. So they can nest on freshwater or saltwater. They can nest in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. They're widely distributed. So they're beloved across the world. And they're very successful species. In North America, like some other species of birds, they were seriously impacted in the middle part of the 20th century by pesticide use. So, pesticides and many other chemicals and minerals and compounds that are found in the environment, they sort of bioaccumulate in the food chain. So the higher up the food chain you go, the more concentrated some of these substances will be in the animals that are ingesting them. So osprey are what we would call an apex predator. They're right at the top of the food chain. And feeding on fish, particularly with pesticides, a lot of the runoff and whatnot will carry the pesticides into the water, into smaller fish or other organisms that the fish are eating. So fish are often a good barometer of what sort of contaminants there might be in the environment. And unfortunately, osprey, in the course of eating the fish, were contaminating themselves. And what that was doing, without going too deep into the science, it was affecting their ability to really produce viable eggs. So it wasn't affecting the adult osprey that were ingesting the DDT, was the chemical in question. It was that it was affecting their inability to successfully reproduce young. And so the population, probably in the middle part of the 20th century, started in North America, started showing real signs of decline, and continued for several decades to decline to the point where osprey were becoming scarce. They weren't non-existent, but they were scarce, and there were some strongholds in places where they weren't as impacted by the pesticides, where they were doing okay. But it, particularly in Massachusetts, their numbers, got quite low, and no one really knows exactly how low the number got in Massachusetts. Let's say in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, but probably under 100 pairs across the entire state, maybe as low as 50 pairs. So, the environmental movement was, some people will say, was started on the back of Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, right? So that was really started a movement that woke people up to what was happening particularly with DDT. The whole name of the book Silent Spring is, that whole book was about the issues that she saw that were being created by the use of DDT and that particular pesticide. So there was a wide range of species that were being impacted. So I think it was in the 70s, DDT was banned. Some other laws were enacted as well at the same time. But banning DDT in the U.S. and basically in North America, Canada followed suit, was a turning point for Osprey. And they were able to start reproducing again more successful. There were some innovative programs that were started where there was some transplanting of viable eggs from one area where they were nesting successfully to other areas where pairs were having a harder time. But eventually the population started to recover in the 70s and in the 80s. And I'll tell you more about sort of what's happening now. But to drill in even further, in Essex County, which is particularly of interest to Greenbelt because that's our service area. Osprey, for one reason or another, they would pretty much disappeared since probably the mid 19th century. And that had more to do with the clearing of the landscape than had to do with anything else. It was probably, the landscape was probably 90+% cleared for agriculture in the 18th century, and certainly into the 19th century that continued, as farming was the primary way of life. So probably it was a habitat loss issue for Osprey, but we did some research, tried to go back into early bird records at the Peabody Museum and other places that have some great historical records on birds in Essex County, and could find no record back to like 1850 of any osprey nesting in the county. So there were some different dynamics going on here in Essex County, but nonetheless, as the population started to increase in New England and particularly in Massachusetts, the first pair appeared in Essex County in the early 1980s. It was right here in Essex, Mass, on a man-made platform. And what I'll say is that probably in the around the time that the population was starting to recover, Osprey started nesting more and more in man-made structures, particularly on utility poles, and that became an issue in itself. So that's really was the driving force behind these artificial and man-made platforms being put up in various places as they tried to lure the birds away from the phone poles and over onto the man-made platforms where they weren't interfering with the wires and the transformers.
That is fascinating.
So that became really popular and successful, and just continued on. So a few platforms were put up here in Essex County in the 80s.
And who was doing that work, Dave?
Well, the very first nest was just on a private property, some marshland out in Essex. But then the state started putting up some platforms. The state Division of Fisheries and Wildlife came out and put up some platforms. And and people were doing platforms, all over Massachusetts and Long Island and different places. They were becoming the norm, really, for osprey nesting.
Were you already seeing the good news about the lack of DDT in the environment? Were the eggs more viable?
Yeah. So the DDT being removed from the equation, really, there was immediate results to that. And osprey numbers started to spring back throughout New England, and really throughout the U.S. So as the Massachusetts population started to grow, the birds started to spread out into areas that where there weren't many ospreys, like Essex County. That first pair showed up in the early 80s, and then a couple of other pairs. And I think it was a very slow growth in the early years, but and honestly, I don't know exactly what how the numbers grew, because Greenbelt and my involvement didn't really start till 15 or so years ago, in the mid 2004, 5, 6, when, partially out of personal interest, I started noticing that there weren't a lot of platforms around, and the birds were nesting on structures in the salt marshes, in particular, like old hunting camps and hunting blinds. And I've told this story many times, but I was watching a nest in the about in the 2004-5 time range, and it was on an old hunting blind on the edge of the marsh, edge of a creek, and the weight of the nest collapsed the blind in the middle of the nesting season. So, whatever was going on in that nest, whether they were eggs or chicks, I'm not sure, but that was a total loss for that pair that year. And so a little light bulb went off in my head and said, we ought to be paying a little bit more attention, and maybe trying to get some platforms put up and figure out where the osprey are. How many are there? We didn't really know. I mean, personally, I've always been interested in birds. I have a degree in wildlife biology. I've always done bird-related work. Early part of my career, I worked with the trustees of reservations for 13 years, doing a lot of beach nesting bird work and other things related to wildlife ecology. So I brought some of that here to Greenbelt with me, some of that interest and knowledge. So
can I just back up and ask it one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
When basically you felt was it deforestation that changed the environment for the ospreys so drastically in Essex County when agriculture took over, because they want their nests up high and in trees? Is that what?
Yes, and I should. Yeah, so I should have. I didn't really explain much about osprey natural history, but their natural nesting habitat would be in a tree. Okay. And it would be a large stick nest built, well off the ground. Could be, in a huge old pine tree that's quite high up, or it could be in a smaller tree that's lower down. But usually they're gonna try to get into the highest spot that they can in the area that they want to nest. So that's why phone poles and to this day, cell towers and other high structures are popular spots for them. And if you go down to Florida and other places, you'll often see big osprey nests way up in these cell towers and radio towers. Wow. And we see a little bit of that around here. So yeah, they want to be off the ground in a tree, which is why the platforms kind of worked as a substitute. But yes, probably throughout Massachusetts, the numbers were suppressed by deforestation, but then really suppressed in the 50s and 60s, and coming out of World War II, that's when DDT use really got ramped up, and food production was really important, and the middle class was growing, and the economy was booming, and we needed to produce a lot of food, and the big farms were starting, these big mega farms were starting to come into play, and DDT was being used really widely. So
you started this really ambitious and interesting program to sort of build these platforms and work really closely with the birds, right?
Yeah, but it had pretty modest. It had a pretty modest beginning. We decided that we would put our first platform up here at our headquarters in Essex at the Cox Reservation, where we're on the edge of the salt marsh. So that's what we did. And I think 2008, we put up a platform here. Might have been 2007. I sometimes forget exactly which year, but and sure enough, we got a pair attracted to that platform. So at that point, we started putting up a few more platforms, sometimes on Greenbelt land, sometimes on other people's land where I thought there would be likely to be good spots for the Osprey. So so fast forward to about 2010 or 11, we had a pair here at nesting at our office. We were seeing some more pairs around, and the total number of pairs in the county was probably like 8 to 10 at that point. Not very many, but a solid number. And then we decided to put a webcam on the nest here at the Cox Reservation, and that sort of brought in this whole group of people that were nature lovers, wildlife lovers, webcam fans, and that really took the program. It put a focus on the program and allowed us to well, I shouldn't say it allowed us. It pushed us to really create a program. Initially, it was just, let's put up an Osprey platform and see what happens. And then it started to grow from there. And we decided, we need to get organized here and actually create a program with various focus areas and run it that way and actually start to fundraise and try to raise some dollars to support the work. And that's what we did. Shortly after 2008, I want to say around 2010, we probably sort of officially created the Osprey program here at Greenbelt. And it kind of had, 4 focus areas. One was, managing Ospreys, meaning putting up platforms, repairing and managing platforms, and doing that type of work. And then it had a monitoring component, which was to recruit volunteers to help us track nests. I mean, I do some of it, and my staff does some of that tracking as well. But we created a program for citizen scientists to collect information, and then we created a very simple online report form that they could go to on our website and fill it out and submit reports. And that's been critical in helping me track the population as it's grown, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then a third component was education, just putting out information. Really, we have a lot of information about Osprey on our website. We have kiosks in different places. We've run programs all over the place over the years. And then the third part, which was a little bit only for really intense for a few years, less so now, was research. We got connected with this researcher that was doing some really fascinating research by putting solar-powered telemetry devices on Osprey and tracking their movements. And he was trying to understand how far these birds went, when they left, how far they flew in a day, and how the different younger birds and adult birds, how they moved. Did they move together? So he was studying these birds through this satellite telemetry work, and we were able to kind of piggyback on his research, raise some money for some of these satellite transmitters. He came and put them on some birds, and we had a few birds that we were tracking for a number of years. Unfortunately, none of them are, Osprey, an individual bird can live 15 to 25 years, but the mortality rate when they're young is pretty high. So, it's probably only about 10% of the birds that make it to, say, 5 years old. But once they hit 5 years old, their survival rate probably jumps to, 70 or 80% for the next 10 plus years. So we were tagging these young birds. That's the part of the research project we got involved with. He was trying to study the young birds.
So you did learn, you were able to track Flo, is that his name?
Yep. There's a lot of information about Flo on our website and on the story map. If you've seen the story map on our website, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's
so
really cool.
Flo was we actually put transmitters on 4 different young osprey, but Flo was the only one that really survived an extended period of time, years. And even he didn't. We think he, just based on size and everything, when we banded him and captured him, we think Flo was a male. He made 4 full migrations, and on the 5th one, going back down south is when something happened. We're not sure what. So that was really fun, because there's amazing software now that could basically download the data from his transmitter and put it directly on a map. So it wasn't real-time information, but every 3 days there would be a data download, and you'd get a whole new track for where Flo or any other bird with a telemetry device on it had gone. And it was kind of neat, because you could look at these maps, and Dr. Rob Beauregard was the researcher. And so you could look at a map that had a compilation of all the birds that he was tracking at the time, with all these different color-coded tracks. And it might have, at the height of his work with us, and he was doing other work with other people, but at that time, in the 5 years ago or so, he might have had 10 or 15 birds with trackers on them. So it was neat to see that map and see where all the birds went. Some from Canada, some from Massachusetts, Long Island, all different places. But when they migrate, they move on a pretty similar migratory route, most of them.
So it looked to me as if Flo really liked Cuba.
Yeah, so they'll stop in. Some might even stop in the southern U.S. in Florida or the Gulf Coast, but most of them end up in Central and South America. And yeah, Flo, Cuba's a major route. The typical migratory route is to go down the Atlantic seaboard for our birds, down the Atlantic seaboard, Florida Keys, hop over to Cuba, cross the Caribbean Sea, and end up in most of them in South America. But some will stop along the way and just not keep going. Mm. So Flo did end up in Cuba and stayed there. All of his wintering was done in Cuba, never went beyond there. So that was kind of cool. Unfortunately he didn't. We were really excited that he was going to make it, back up that next year, because he probably, as a 4-year-old, he might have actually nested, and his survival rate would have gone up. But so be it. Anyways, that was the 4 components of the program were, management, monitoring, education, and research. And a little bit less research going on now, more just data collection of what's happening each year. A little bit of banding of chicks to try to, that is research, but, we don't get a lot of band. You hope not to get many band recoveries, because typically if you get a band recovery on a bird like that, it's probably because someone found it, not alive.
Well, you have a number of platforms, and I love your site because you can go and click on these platforms and see how active the birds have been on each one of them, right? Right.
So we've maintained this Google map, and it probably isn't very well updated for 2020 yet, but some sites might be. But yeah, so that shows you all the nesting areas all the nesting sites we know of over time. Some of which are maybe inactive now, or were only active for 1 year, or some that completely washed away and aren't even there anymore. But yeah, it's kind of neat. I think there's it's up to 80 or even 90 different sites that birds have nested over the years. But the active sites are like you said, are mostly platforms these days. I think this year there'll probably be 50 to 55 nesting pairs in our area, which I call the area north of Boston, because we've started to include East Boston and Revere in our area, which aren't technically in Essex County. Most of the nests in our area are on man-made platforms, but quite a few others are on structures of one sort or another, be they these marsh hunting camps or hunting blinds or channel markers, power lines.
So the most famous one that I know of is the one behind Lobsterland.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and there are a few. There are a few in trees. We have a couple nests in trees actually, and just the other day I found a new nest. So I know we're not seeing. I'm sure we're not finding every single nest that's out there, because they're hard to find, and particularly ones in the interior. And most of the people that are looking for me are looking primarily at nests that are already known. But when I get out there and can really cruise around by boat or in some of these different areas, I'll look really hard around the edges of the marsh in different areas, and so periodically get lucky and find a new nest. So in the last week we found but I've been doing a little bit more of that, and we found a couple of new ones last week, which was cool.
Well, you're going to be showing us some footage of the webcam that's on the Lobsterland platform, right? So do you want to just describe what's happening with that family for us?
Yeah, so, well, I'll back up and say that we had the webcam here at the Cox Reservation on the nest here, and as often happens in nature, something happened to the male osprey from that pair, we think. So the female, eventually the pair stopped nesting on this platform. And we had this webcam here all set up and shooting live streaming video of an empty nest. So that wasn't much fun for anyone. So I started thinking about where we could move the camera, set it up in a different spot. And so in 2000, so this is 2020. So I think in 2017, the Lobsterland platform had been up for a few years, probably 6 or 7 at this point. And like in 2017, late in the season, a pair landed on that nest and started bringing in a few sticks, which is very typical of a young pair of osprey. Maybe they only sort of found each other during the summer, and then later in the season, when most of the older pairs were, well into their nesting season, or maybe even wrapping up their nesting season, these guys are sort of, they're having fun as a couple, and they're starting to establish a nest site for themselves that they might use in the future. So,
and can we pause here and say they mate for life, right?
Exactly. Good point. They once they pair bond, they unless something happens, they will mate for life. So 2018, they returned and built a decent nest, and everything looked like, but they didn't lay eggs. So I was like, okay, these guys are really locking in. If they follow the normal biological pattern, the next year they should come back and lay eggs. So I sort of rolled the dice and I said, we're going to set the webcam up here, because the key thing about setting up a webcam is you can solar power it, but you've got to have something fairly close by that you can stream, wirelessly stream the video to. So the restaurant provided a great opportunity to do that. And the owner of the restaurant, Corey Gramis, was super into it and really, really cooperative and let us set up everything we needed to set up there. So we set it up last spring, and thankfully the birds came back and laid their first clutch of eggs in 2019 and fledged one young. And so the last year we coined the names Annie and Squam for the male and female, which was obviously a play on the name Annisquam, the river that they're very close to. And then they had one chick last year that survived, and his name was River. And then this year, they've even been more successful, and they hatched all 3 of their eggs. And those 3 have been named, as you know, Liz and, Vivi and Rusty. Anyways, and they hatched well over a month ago. I think they're about 6 weeks old now, and they're really getting quite large. And it's been an exciting year, because even all the years the webcam was here at the Cox Reservation, we never had a nest with multiple chicks in it. Needless to say, 3. So it's really been fun to see a nest full of chicks and see them interacting and see them growing, and they're doing great. The parents are phenomenal. They, keeping them well fed and well protected, and so everything.
The parents are still Annie and Squam, right?
Same parents, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Well, it's so much fun to watch this webcam, and webcam, and so we did some analytics on our website last week, I think, and it's like 60% of the visits to our website last week were just to visit the webcam page. So it's hugely popular. We've had like 60 or more thousand hits on that page. Now that could be you hitting it, 10 times a day, every day for weeks. So it's not 60,000 individual people, but it's a lot of visits to that particular page on our website, which is great. And it's exciting, and it's sort of a unique outreach opportunity for Greenbelt. So can we anticipate that Liz and Vivi and Rusty will be flying off with Annie and Squam soon?
So how this will play out is, at some point in the next, I'd say, week or so, these birds the 3 chicks will probably attain flight. So they will go from being chicks to being fledglings. And as fledglings, as I mentioned earlier, they'll need to learn to become independent. They'll need to learn to fish on their own and sort of find their way. So, but they will remain with that nest as a home base for a period of time, which could be a week or 2 or even 3. Now they won't all be there all the time as much, and they'll start roosting at other sites around the nest site. So if you were just there with your binoculars watching, you might see birds perched in trees at the edge of the marsh that are probably the fledglings that during the day or even at night are just not going to roost on the nest. They're going to roost somewhere else. But they're probably going to still come back to the nest, and the adult birds will continue to be around for a while. The female typically leaves first, so they I should back up to say that they migrate completely independently of one another.